What's up, guys, and welcome back to MoAn Inc. If you guys are new here, then hello. My name is Erica, and it is a pleasure to have you joining me today on the channel. Because for today's video, as you can see from the title, I am chatting to Professor Emily Wilson, who is a translator of the newly released Iliad by Homer. Obviously, Homer is not newly released, but this particular translation is. Now today, although we will be exclusively talking about the translation choices that were made within this particular text, this is not the only work that Dr. Wilson has actually reproduced for the modern world, for our lovely eyes, for actors, for readers, whoever it happens to be. I will be linking all of those in the description below, including her Odyssey translation. But today I wanted to really get into the nitty-gritty of the choices that were made, the feedback that lots of the classics community has had about this particular translation. However, I don't want to scare anybody off from this interview because I plan to be getting into a lot of the basics of translation as well. You know, what it means to do a translation, how to go about doing a translation. So by the time we get into the nitty-gritty of the ancient Greek regarding Homer, hopefully we will have established a nice base for everybody to then work from. But with all that being said, Dr. Wilson, it is about time that we hand this over to you. So first and foremost, can you take us back to being a young woman in Britain, which is where you're from, and discovering classics for the first time? Take us to that moment and what was so special about classics to you at that age that made you want to continue to being the professor and the classicist that you are today?
So I first sort of learned about that Greek mythology was a thing when I was 8 years old in elementary school. I went to just the local Church of England elementary school, and the teachers were bored of doing the same old nativity play every year, so they did an Odyssey play adapted for 8-year-olds to play it. And I got to be Athena, and it was exciting, and it was sort of I just realized how exciting those stories were, both that it was fun to inhabit a world full of magic and goddesses. And then I also then read lots of kids' adaptations of Greek myth. And then once I got to high school, I had the opportunity to start learning Latin and then Greek. And I fell in love with the languages and the texts as well at that stage.
So before we can get to Homer, I know that that was not your first rodeo when it came to translation, that you were asked to translate the 6 tragedies of Seneca for Oxford World Classics. And what really stood out to me, because I actually had that translation even before you had done all of the Odyssey ones, which was interesting to find on my shelf. Yeah. But you wrote in that introduction, I have aimed to make my version readable, speakable, and contemporary. So this is something that's always been really important for you in the art of translation. Why?
I mean, I think in the case of drama, I think it has to be speakable because the original texts are speakable. I mean, there are ancient texts which are definitely aiming to archaize. There are ancient texts which are not as speakable as these texts are. But the texts that I've translated have all been either plays, like those tragedies of Seneca or Sophocles or Euripides, which I've also published translations of, or the Homeric poems, which were almost always experienced in antiquity in performance, and they're these multi-voice texts which have multiple different characters within them. I mean, of course, Seneca and Homer couldn't be more stylistically different, and I wanted to bring out those differences in the translations. But at the same time, I wanted to make sure that the reader, even if you're reading it rather than watching the play or listening to the audiobook, that you have a sense of this is speakable and that you can imagine how could an actor perform this character.
Right. So then what exactly is Homeric Greek for those people that are like, what is Dr. Wilson reading on the page?
Yes. So in fact, I'm reading, looks like this. There you go. So it's not, modern Greek people read Homer in translation because it's so distant. I mean, if you think about, can you read Beowulf? Just pick up a copy of Beowulf and flip through if you're an English speaker. No, you can't. And Homer is 2,000 years older than Beowulf is for us. Homeric Greek is composed in a traditional poetic form. It's a language that nobody ever actually spoke. So for me, using a traditional poetic meter was essential because this traditionalness of the language is really important. It's a language that was developed over the course of many centuries when the Greek-speaking world had no literacy. And then all of a sudden, we don't know exactly how this happened, but in the 8th century, the Greek-speaking world borrowed from the Phoenicians the alphabet, developed it into an alphabet. And we think fairly soon after that, the Homeric poems were composed using this new technology of writing, but drawing on this long previous oral tradition. So Homeric Greek, I mean, you asked about how is it different also from later periods of Greek. It's totally different from modern Greek in its syntax, in its vowel sounds, in, you know, a lot of things are very different, though there is overlap in vocabulary. And it's also very different from later 5th century or 4th century Greek. So the Greek of Plato is very, very different from the Greek of Homer. And both of those are very different from the Koine Greek of the New Testament.
And when it comes to tackling the text of Homer, there's so much more than just the language that you have to get into. There's also just the different world that the late Bronze Age was, and having to kind of peer into that world and translate that world through the language that you choose. And you did so much extra research with this translation, including talking to servicemen and women, and also even like Googling videos of animals because of all of the metaphors that are used for lions and all of this. So why is that so integral? Like, just again, I'm thinking of the everyday person that's wondering, why do you need to look at a video of a lion or talk to soldiers to translate this text? Like, what else is going on in the text that you need through those videos and through that extra research that comes out?
Yes, I mean, the most of my research was to do with reading Homeric scholarship and reading the commentaries on the text. I mean, I think it's worth mentioning the other stuff because to me it was a surprise. I mean, for none of my previous scholarly monographs did I feel I need to know what it sounds like when a bow is when somebody shoots a bow, but I need to have those sounds in my head if I want to try to recreate whatever the text might be doing about evoking the sounds of Apollo's arrows swishing through camp. And of course, the English language doesn't have the same vocabulary for sounds or for sight or for color or for feelings in the body. All of these things are very specific to a particular language. I mean, that would be true of any language pair, but the Iliad is so intense in how it represents the body, the feelings, the sounds, that I felt that part of what I need to do in this translation, if my goal is not just to look up some words in the dictionary or tell you, do the kind of translation that you would do if you're an intermediate language student and you're trying to prove to your teacher, I've done the homework and I can tell you for the exam that I have done, I know that that's in the genitive case. That's not what I'm doing. But I know this is in genitive case. That's not the point of these translations. The point is to create an equivalent experience to the experience that I might have if I'm a fluent reader of Homer, or that a reader or a listener in antiquity might have hearing these poems. And that's going to include the vividness of this really does evoke those feelings in a way that, of course, is in some ways totally non-naturalistic. As I said before, it's in this traditional poetic form, it's in this weird language that no one spoke, and yet at the same time, there are things that feel visceral and real, like the feelings, like the sounds.
I think that's so interesting, and to think of the art of translation, something that I always say on my channel is, what I did at university is exactly what you said, which is so literal. And you've got to be like, the boat, comma, having been thrown, and do it very much like this is exactly what's on the page. And then what you do with the translation is tell a story. And I was just wondering if, talking about the English language, do you think in a way that it's restrictive in doing that when it comes to Homer because of the depth of language and
I mean, English has a much bigger vocabulary than Homeric Greek does. So no, it's not restrictive in that way. And I also think that there's something wrong with our pedagogy in the teaching of dead languages. I mean, the fact that somebody like you sort of has this idea that it's exactly the same. This clunky English is exactly the same as this beautiful poem. It's not exactly the same. It's a pedagogical tool, but I think it's a tool that can get in the way of the actual goal, which is becoming fluent in the languages. The actual goal is to experience Homer. The actual goal is not to treat the original like a crossword puzzle, where you're sort of writing this palimpsestic text over the top, which I think, I'm not blaming you for having that idea. I think that's part of the way that the pedagogy works, is that when you learn French or Mandarin, you don't have this idea in beginning language class that my goal is to translate, right? You have this goal that my goal is to speak Spanish, and I'm starting to learn to be fluent in Spanish. Whereas in beginning Latin class, students are sort of encouraged to have this idea that the goal is translation. Before you can actually understand Latin, you translate it, which encourages this really weird relationship with the language and with the text, where you conceptualize them, as I say, as crossword puzzles, rather than as these beautiful, coherent entities in themselves, which have their own style. And the truth about them involves that style and involves the distinctiveness of this is how this passage is different from that passage. So I think we sort of then can get into this idea that there's a pretty lie or there's an ugly truth. And in fact, if the original is pretty, then it's a lie to make it not pretty.
Yeah, and you use iambic pentameter as well in your translation, and you've said that that suits English better than the dactylic hexameter of Homer. So I didn't want to assume that anybody watching would even know what iambic pentameter was. So if you could explain what that is, but also then explain why that works much better in translation in English for Homer.
Yes. So the original, as you say, is in dactylic hexameter. A dactyl is a finger, and it's la la la. So a finger has three parts. So me nina e da a pe le a do a ke le os. It's six parts, and the rhythm is that way all the way through these long epic poems. It's also the rhythm that's used in the Hesiodic poems, Works and Days, and the Theogony. It's the traditional meter for narrative verse within the context of archaic Greece. So I sort of wrestled with, I want to evoke something like a traditional poetic meter, because the sound of the Homeric poems is essential to the experience. And in the classroom, I mean, over the decades that I was teaching these texts, both in the original and in translation, I was always frustrated that the students would, be told by me, yes, the originals were performed out loud, and you can think of it like song lyrics. It has this music, this rhythm. But if you're reading a text that doesn't have a rhythm of any kind in English, which is the case for most of the most read English translations, I mean, the Fagles, the Lattimore, and all the prose ones, they don't have a regular rhythm. So the students aren't getting that rhythm in their bones. I experimented with, could I use a longer line? Could I use an equivalent of dactylic hexameter in English? There are translations by Rodney Merrill that do that. I think they pay a very high price in terms of what are the other elements of the Homeric poems that are also essential. And I mean, that it results in really weird English, weird in ways that I don't think is parallel to the way the Greek is. And it also has this cost of, it doesn't sound traditional, whereas the original sounds traditional. So it seemed to me that just to trigger, even if you're a reader who hasn't heard of iambic pentameter, if you know to be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, and so on. If you know that rhythm, and it seemed to me that the only way to trigger something analogous to the experience of here's this traditional rhythm, which was there for any listener to even a tiny fragment of Homer, you hear a traditional rhythm. The only thing that's equivalent in the Anglophone poetic tradition is iambic pentameter.
So do you hope that then when people pick up your translation, because again, like my audience, so they come to my channel because they want to read these ancient texts and they've never had any training. And I do very basic summaries of like, in case you're lost, here's what's happening, move on to the next chapter. Do you hope that they walk away being able to read then? Is that like not necessarily your primary goal? Obviously, there are so many goals when it comes to Homer, but is that one of the main ones that you hope somebody who maybe didn't have that traditional teaching and that traditional experience with classics is able to walk away with more of a feel of what the text would have been?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, I think in both, I mean, all of my translations, I have introductions and endnotes and maps and glossaries, which include pronunciation. I also have a pronunciation guide on my website, because I think one of the things that people sometimes think of as an obstacle is both, I don't know who all these characters are, and I can't pronounce any of their weird names. But in fact, you don't actually need to know any of that coming into it. The storytelling of Homer is so clear. And even if you don't understand exactly what happened in that scene, you can read it again, read it out loud. I have summaries at the end of the books as well, and the end notes. It's not that difficult. I mean, I think people sometimes have this idea that because in the 20th and 21st century, Homer has become super canonical. We have this idea that canonical must mean high culture in the sense not just that it's very serious and it really is and it's great poetry. That doesn't mean it's difficult, and it's actually not difficult. On the level of storytelling, it's not difficult at all. On the level of human characters that you can understand how they feel and why, it's not difficult at all.
So when it comes to your translation, I know that for 2 years you were quite stuck on it, that you have said, and you wrote as well as in your introduction, how you had a 2 year struggle with it and then it kind of clicked and you know, knew how you wanted to go about it. So what was the original plan for the Iliad for you as the translator? What did you want to do? And also, I think it might be beneficial to also go into like, what was the wall that you hit that you went, you know what, this is great. This isn't going to harm my pride when I walk away from this and I try something different.
Yeah, so I mean, with both the Odyssey, which I signed up for like 12 years ago or something, and then I worked on that for 5 or 6 years and published that one. And then when I went on to the Iliad, in both cases, the first year or two were very difficult. And I thought, and of course, in both cases, I'd come up with a vision for what I wanted to do. I mean, with a translation, as with any book, you have to write a book proposal to convince the publishers that this is worth this is worth doing, and there's a possibility that somebody might want to read it, and it's not doing the exact same thing as a million other books that are already out there. I mean, that's a question with a retranslation, as with any other kind of book. So in both cases, with the Homeric poems, with these translations, I had a vision for what I wanted to do. As I already said, I wanted to prioritize meter in a way that isn't done by most of the existing translations. I also wanted to think through how, I think over the past decade or two of Homeric scholarship, there's been so much more recognition of how multi-voiced the narratives are, how Achilles doesn't speak the same as any other character. Helen doesn't speak the same. The points of view of the narrator are constantly shifting around. I felt in existing translations that I'd used with my students, there was this sort of flattening tendency to present the narrative as all more or less the same, and we're usually looking through Odysseus's perspective, and it doesn't shift around in the interesting ways that the original does. And the diversity of points of view wasn't necessarily there in the translations in the way that it is in the Greek. So I sort of had a vision with both of these projects, and then exercising it, figuring out how exactly do I make it come alive in the way that the originals are alive. That's a writing challenge. It's not a reading challenge. I mean, I think people sometimes, if they haven't done translations, sometimes think the main thing is understanding what the original says. And that's actually not the main thing. I mean, I've been reading Homer for decades. It wasn't that I would be stuck on, I don't know what that word means, because if I forgot what that word means, I can look it up. It's not that hard. And Homeric Greek is not that hard. I mean, that's part of what I also wanted to convey, is the clarity of the syntax, that it's not that difficult to understand in the original if you spend a while learning it. And yet, how do I convey that clarity or that emotional impact or that sound or that rhythm using completely different words? And I would sort of constantly get stuck with both the Odyssey and the Iliad over those first few drafts of feeling I'm doing what I think I should be doing, and yet the bread isn't rising, right? I mean, just that question of a writing project that has to feel fully alive and it has to have its own identity, which needs to feel completely intimately connected to the identity of this previous text that I deeply revere and want to sort of make it accessible to people who can't read the original, but I hope will be excited by it if I can do my job of conveying what's exciting about it. So I started at the beginning with the Iliad, and my first drafts I had to revise much more than my later drafts. One sort of maybe boring technical thing is that I wanted to echo the pacing of the Homeric poems in ways that I felt weren't done by many translations. Many of them I think are too long compared to the original and therefore seem too boring, because of course there's always the temptation for any translator to recognize that this word could mean 5 different things, so I put down 5 different things, but then you end up with a translation that's kind of padded and much longer than the original is. So with the Odyssey, I sort of confined myself to the same number of lines as the original to force myself not to expand. And I thought at first I would do that with the Iliad, and it proved to be impossible because there are so many names in the Iliad, and a name can't be any shorter than it is. So if I say Agamemnon, son of Atreus, it's taken up the whole line, and I actually need more lines to make it work. And then even beyond that sort of technical thing, making sure the characters sound, quote unquote, right, whatever that is. Getting the anger of both Achilles and Agamemnon conveyed in that first book in a way that seems excessive but not melodramatic. And I just felt I had to do dozens and dozens of drafts before I was sort of conveying both the extremity of the emotions and the text's empathy for these characters.
So I feel like we can now get a little bit nitty-gritty with the language. Hopefully everybody's caught up at least to what the translation is, what you can expect from the poem, some of the difficulties. So you've made lots of choices when it comes to your translation. Obviously, that is your job. And one of the ones I wanted to touch on was how you call the Greek army the Greeks. And I quote you when I say, I therefore chose to call the invaders the Greeks because the Achaeans would risk alienating or confusing the reader for no particularly good end that I could see, which is very much echoed in what you've already said in this interview. But I was wondering when it comes to specific choices like that, so for example, the Greeks over the Achaeans, obviously, people might not know that that doesn't really get to the meat of the political system in the late Bronze Age of Greece. So as the translator, but also as the professor, is there like a little voice in your head that's like, oh, that's not necessarily correct, but we have to get rid of that because the purpose of this poem is to be readable, it's to be contemporary?
I mean, as I said about meter, it's to be traditional but also clear in the ways that the original is clear. And then if there is difficulty, I want there to be payoff about the difficulty. In the case of the Achaeans and the Danaans, the Archaoi and the Danaoi, those don't refer in a specific way to this. The Achaeans come from Achaea. So, and the Danaans come from wherever. They're used in this really vague way in the traditional language of Homer. So they refer to Greek speakers in a collective and vague way. I mean, I've seen in the classroom how students go in this sort of rabbit hole of how are the Danaans different from the Achaeans? And you sort of waste half an hour explaining that they're not different. They're all coming from the Greek-speaking world. It seems to me that I have 100 pages of introduction, which includes, many students are going to skip it, but if you want to read that, you will learn that, yes, Greece was not a nation state back in the day, and it was the land of Hellas didn't exist in the way that it did later in the classical period. Those historical facts are there. And you can also see by studying the maps at the start of my translation of the Iliad, just all the different principates, or that's again is an anachronistic word, but all these different areas of the Greek-speaking world from which the Greek-speaking forces come. I'm not going to use a lumbering word like Greek-speaking, and it seems to me that Achaeans, as I said, sort of is likely to throw the reader off in ways that I don't think have payoff. I think if I can, and it also throws off the weight of the line, because it's harder to make it work within the rhythms in many cases. And then if I use it sometimes and not other times, again, the reader's going to be confused about something which isn't difficult in the original. If you're listening to the original and you have a sense already of what is the traditional language by which the Homeric poems refer to Greek-speaking people, we know already that it's the Achaioi, because that's part of knowing Homeric Greek. So it seems to me that if I want an equivalent experience in terms of comprehensibility, then the closest equivalent is to use Greek, meaning Greek speaking. Even though, yes, of course, it's not exactly the same thing, because there's this potential for, you may think, oh, that means that there's a Greek nation. But then you could read even just a few pages of anything about archaic Greece, and you would learn that's wrong, including read my introduction. So I'm not sure that it matters. I mean, I think it's a worthwhile payoff. And of course, every translation choice has these, there's no exact equivalent of anything from one language to another. That's not how languages work.
Well, picking up off of that, it's funny, when I was looking up reviews of your Iliad translation, everybody seemed very focused on one of the first words that you translate, and it's become the topic of so many discussions that I've seen, or even that I've heard amongst like the classics community here. Everyone wants to talk about your translation of the first word of the second line of the Greek, which is cataclysmic. And that is this huge discussion. And part of me has wondered, I wonder if just everybody opened it and they saw the first different word and they were like, we're going to talk about that one endlessly.
Yeah.
But regardless of that, this word in ancient Greek has been translated in many different ways. And just in case you guys who are watching have only read translations, if you go to Hammond, it's accursed. If you go to Alexander or Green, it's calamitous. Fitzgerald is ruinous. Latimer, destructive. The list goes on and on and on. And yours, the use of the word cataclysmic, is really poignant, but it's also really interesting because it kind of evokes this more natural disaster element to that. Can you just talk a little bit more about that?
Yes. I mean, so maybe one thing I would want to say is that I think one thing I really struggled with is how to make a word that connotes deadliness or I, narrator, I'm cursing you. This is like, gadam, this menace. And which is achieved partly by enjambment. So the first two lines of the poem, menina edetha peleia doekeleos ulomanen. So it has this, like, the delay of the epithet, which is not right before the word that it modifies. You can't actually do that in English, because if I put an adjective way after the word that it's supposed to modify, and in English we can't tell that that's supposed to go with that. So of course Greek word order is different because it's a much more highly inflected language. In order to convey the oomph of this word, I felt I need to think through what possibilities are there for something that connotes damned or deadly, but really sounds deadly. Because deadly does not sound deadly. Deadly sounds cartoonish and ridiculous. It needs to sound scary, and it needs to sound as if we really do know how enormous the implications of this divine scale anger. I mean, the other word that when we could talk about every word in the proem, but the word menace is a kind of anger that's not the same as regular human anger, which does also exist in the Iliad. Words like cholos, and I sort of try to make sure I'm keeping a distinction between wrath and wrathful for the divine anger connoted by menis and menimos, and the more human scale anger connoted by these other words like holos. I felt that in order to make sure it really sounds impactful, even though I can't do the same word order, I need to think through what kinds of words are there available in English that might have some of that kind of oomph of it's very, very large scale deadly. I like the sound, and I like the number of syllables being the same as the original. And I like the idea that, I mean, once I thought of cataclysmic, I thought, as you say, that those connotations of natural disaster, is it too much? Is it slightly wrong in terms of it's damned and accursed, but it isn't necessarily explicitly about natural disaster? And yet, the more I thought about it, the more I thought, in English, the word cataclysm is first used for Noah's flood. And there's this sort of idea in the references to the plan of Zeus. If you read the ancient commentaries on that first line of the Iliad that refers to the plan of Zeus, there's this reference to the myth that Zeus had a plan to help out Mother Earth being overburdened by the mortal men population. So Zeus's plan to help her out was to ensure destruction of humans, because Earth doesn't want too many humans on her. So Zeus's plan then involved ensuring that Helen and Achilles would be born, and that would mean these large-scale wars, the Theban War and then the Trojan War, that would result in tons of humans dying. So, and then we also, in the course of the Iliad, we're going to have a kind of cataclysm with the river rising up against Achilles when Achilles has clogged the river with bodies. And in the course of his wrath, which entails this overstepping, not just of human norms, like the norms to spare suppliants, which is favored by Zeus, but Achilles oversteps it when he returns to battle. The human norms to help out your comrades, which of course Achilles is overstepping by developing this plan to ensure a massacre on his own side, which usually people don't think in the Homeric world is an honorable, desirable thing to do. But that he's also overstepping natural norms in clogging the river and having the river rise up and say, please stop clogging me up with corpses. So it seemed to me that maybe cataclysmic kind of works because it does speak to the ways that Achilles' wrath and the whole plan of Zeus are both human and natural disasters, and of course also quasi-divine disasters, because he's the son of a sea goddess. He has a sea goddess on his side, along with Zeus, in this causing of disaster in the end, both for Greeks, Trojans, and himself.
Well, I was also going to say that was something that I noticed when I was reading it, that there was a lot that I was connecting through that word of cataclysm. As silly as that sounds, like as I was reading it for like the millionth time, I was like, oh, that's actually, that does work really well. Because I also spoke to Dr. Gregory Nash about the Iliad and about the way that he attacked it and his analysis of it. And we did a big discussion as well about how Achilles is paralleled to Apollo a lot throughout the poem.
Yes,
and I thought that, you know, cataclysm was such a great word to also get across, like you were saying, that divine element to Achilles that I think obviously his mother is a goddess, but there's so much more to his divine rage and his divine anger, and adding in that word, I think at least kind of touched on that a little bit better than just accursed.
Yes,
for
I mean,
example.
accursed also just has no impact to it, right? I mean, it doesn't sound scary, right? It sounds cartoonish again. I mean, deadly and accursed, I think both just, I mean, sometimes words get worn out, and I think those words are a little bit worn out. But the connections between Achilles and Apollo are super interesting. I mean, we maybe shouldn't get into that as a side note, but it's super interesting. I mean, I was just the way that in Hecuba's final lament for Hector, one of the details in what she says is that Hector looks so beautiful, as if Apollo with his arrows had taken his life, right? And of course we know that Achilles actually took his life, but that sort of equation between the arrows of Apollo and the power of Achilles is there, I think, running through the poem. And I think it also then matters that it's Apollo among the Greek council at the start of 24 who is the most vociferous in saying we have to stop this desecration.
No, absolutely. But sticking with your translation, because as you said, I could go down a rabbit hole of just Achilles and we'll be here talking about something completely different. But I was really curious, like how much of your translation has to kind of get, and I guess this is the wrong word, but filtered through an editor. Because I know that, for example, you know, you use saffron robes in your translation. I think that I read that you had said, I think it was the New Yorker, that you had wanted to use crocus colored robes instead in that particular instance, but the editor was like, who's going to know what the hell a crocus is? That's not going to work. So how much of the translation has to be collaborative with the editor?
So about that particular one, so the Greek is krokopeplos, so it connotes crocus colored, but of course crocuses come in more than one color. So and it seems pretty clear that there's this idea that it's golden or yellow because that's what within archaic Greek krokos suggests. So I felt that if I mean, it wasn't that I was going to do it because he said so, because, you know, I can not do what he says if I don't think it's right. I mean, there's a discussion with any reader or editor. But it seemed to me that I was persuaded that there's this vivid image where if you read the Greek, you're not thinking, hang on, what color is that? You know it's yellow. Whereas if I use crocus colored, the reader is likely not to know that it's yellow. And so in order to create the same cognitive effect, I needed to do something different. And similarly, if I use a phrase that might have an implication that the Greek doesn't have, maybe I'm going to need to rethink that. Or if I use a phrase that's too British and American readers are going to get thrown off, maybe I need to rethink that. I mean, so what I would do multiple drafts by myself and read it out loud to myself, read the Greek out loud, read the English out loud, sort of work on it many times until I felt I was pretty happy with it. Then I would share it with my Norton editor, who doesn't read Greek, but is a good reader of English. So he would very often catch things that might be ambiguous in English and sort of test whether or not I want that ambiguity. Because of course, sometimes I want ambiguity. Sometimes there's an ambiguity in the Greek that I'm trying to get across in the English. But then if there's ambiguity that's not in the Greek, but that I've introduced in the translation, then I want to know about that. And I want to rewrite to make sure that it's only as ambiguous as the Greek is and not more so, which I think is part of the difficulty of the writing process. And then I would typically share what I would think would be an already very much worked over draft with both colleagues and grad students of my acquaintance and friends. It's useful to have this sort of army of grad students available, because then I wanted to have feedback from readers who've read the Greek as well as from readers who haven't read the Greek, and to have a sense of, how do you think this might work in your class, and how does it strike you when you're reading this next to the Greek? And then I would usually get, second, third, fourth rounds of feedback from different people, and it was always really useful. And sometimes people would make suggestions that I didn't agree with, and that's also useful. It's useful to know both what might I want to revise, and also where do I feel I'm going to dig in my heels, because actually that does make sense. And then maybe I add an endnote to explain, why is this what I'm doing here?
Well, something I thought was really fun, actually, that you did on your Twitter account, which, do we call it X now? I'm not sure. I haven't really switched over.
I call it Twitter.
So on your Twitter account in 2023, you actually published a number of tweets where you were posing the questions to your audience, but presumably classists and nerds, of just, here's what I'm tackling with, how can somebody do this? So there was one in particular that I wanted to pull out and to sort of tell everybody about in case they didn't see it. But you wrote, another dilemma. Andromache is described at 483 or 495, in case you guys don't know, those are the line numbers, as Phele. I probably butchered the pronunciation of all the Greek words I tried, but that's okay. Wife of Hector. This suggests love and kinship, but do we translate as loving wife or beloved wife? Which directionality of emotional attachment matters more, and can a translator convey both in English? So already just a very interesting question, but then you can go and check the translation that you did. And if we skip on over to book 6, line 656, you chose beloved wife.
Yeah.
So I was wondering then, from your words, the directionality of emotional attachment, why was that one more important for you? Why was it more important to present Andromache as beloved wife rather than loving wife?
I actually think both are super important. I mean, what you just read is a lot of rhetorical questions, right? I mean, the answer to the rhetorical questions is no, of course you can't choose. Both of these things are important. I'm just checking back through my translation. I did both. So the word Phele occurs twice in that passage. I'm to pull up the Greek, but I use beloved for one of those instances, and loving for another, because I want both of those things to emerge in the translation, because I think both are at stake in the scene. I think it matters both that Hector loves Andromache and that Andromache loves Hector. And I think a translation that sort of only does one with Phele is only doing half of what that epithet can connote. So I wanted both. And I felt in this instance, I can't say beloved / loving in the translation, because that's not, it's going to result in a mess, and the original is not a mess. But if I use beloved in one instance and then loving a few lines later, then I've at least conveyed that both of those elements are there in this relationship, that it is a mutual relationship, even though it's also a relationship in which, in this scene, she's begging him to do something which he's refusing to do. And there's this huge gap in what they each want and how they each see his decision to insist on going to leave his family and leave the city and go and fight.
So I will add links to all of those Twitter threads in the description below so that you guys can find them. But I wanted to give you guys a taste of what those were, because they are really interesting. And as Dr. Wilson then explained, there's always a reason behind the other side of it. But also, I wanted to introduce the idea of loving couples, because a couple that we have to talk about, because I know everybody wants to hear about them, are Achilles and Patroclus. And in particular, I wanted to highlight book 18, because that's sort of where a lot of this loving language starts coming out with Achilles. And in line 80 in the Greek, in case any of my extra nerds have that, or line 99 of your translation, Achilles says, "My friend Patroclus, whom I loved, is dead. I loved him more than any other comrade. I loved him like my head, my life, myself." So I wanted to pull those out, because obviously all of the loving language just there. But for people who don't read the Greek, Achilles and Patroclus are so popular because of the Song of Achilles and all of this imagery surrounding them as a couple. And I was wondering if you could take us to the Greek. Like, what are those words is there a romantic notion in the actually ancient Greek vocabulary used?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, the whole Song of Achilles is very, I mean, many readers of the Iliad may have read Song of Achilles before they come to the Iliad. And even if they haven't read Song of Achilles, they're going to know the Patroclus meme. I mean, everyone knows Patroclus, right? So I write a lot in the introduction about the Iliad's depiction of love and sex, because I think it's important to try to address both the super intensity of the bond that Achilles and Patroclus have. Achilles, of course, has no other human family left. He's never going to see his father again. He knows that. The only person he has is Patroclus. And there are multiple moments in the poem where we get to see that Achilles and Patroclus are quasi-family members. Achilles describes Patroclus as like a little girl tucking his mother's skirt. In the embassy book, the book 9, the presence of the incest story of Meleager with his wife Cleopatra suggests that there's a quasi-spousal relationship between Patroclus and the equivalent figure, which is Achilles. And yet at the same time, Achilles and Patroclus both sleep with enslaved women at their sides. So it's not presented that the intensity of this emotional bond it necessarily means they're only having sex with each other, because of course they're not only having sex with each other, and we're never told they have sex with each other, whereas we are told that several couples who obviously despise each other, including Helen and Paris and Hera and Zeus, do have sex. So that modern idea that the ultimate pinnacle of romantic and intimate attachment is having sex, which is what you get that in Song of Achilles, but you don't get that in the Iliad, because it's ways of presenting what might a most intense intimate relationship look like are very different. So just to go to this passage, which, as you say, is a huge emotional climax. Achilles has, as we've said, been sitting out of battle for the first 2/3 of the poem because of his overwhelming wrath, his menace against Agamemnon and the rest of the Greeks. And he's prayed to his sea goddess mother Thetis to restore his lost honor, or at least get some payback on those who've dissed him by enabling a massacre of the Greeks while he himself does nothing. So again, he's being like Apollo because he's sitting at a distance and causing deaths at a distance. But then at this moment, Achilles realizes the answer to his prayers has also been the worst thing he could possibly have experienced or done, because Patroclus went out wearing his armor as his second self into battle. And as you know it's coming, but it still makes you cry. Of course, he gets himself killed. Of course, Hector is triumphing and kills Patroclus, even though Patroclus is great at killing and enjoys doing it, but he doesn't ultimately manage to push all the way through to the city of Troy as he fantasizes he might be able to do. So in this moment, Achilles has discovered that his dearest person is dead, and he says, after Thetis says, "But I did everything you asked me to do," and mothers never get any credit for anything, and Achilles says, "Yes, you did everything, but what good is that to me? My friend Patroclus is dead." The language is really very simple in the Greek, and there's a simplicity and clarity so we talked already about philae for Andromache, beloved or loving. We have that same word here for Patroclus. He's philos, he's loving and beloved, and it also has this connotation of being a family member. There's a difference between different kinds of beloveds. It's not the language of desirable love object whom you see from afar, and it's also not the language of there are various other ways you could describe a loved person, but the word philos suggests this is part of my kinship group, this is somebody within my household, and also that I love him. It seemed to me crucial in the translation to make sure that the emotions land and that we have a sense of both how strongly Achilles feels, I mean, how desperate he feels in these lines, and also the complexity of the emotions. So for instance, we have a verb, ton apolasa. So it sounds a bit like Apollo, right? But it's the verb apollumi, which suggests either destroyed or killed or lost. So I've looked at a few translations of this passage, and almost all of them go only with that translation of lost. So that in itself, just about that one word, you're making a decision about is what Achilles is experiencing grief, like just grief. He's just lost his dearest person. He's very sad. Yes, he's very sad. I mean, clearly he's very sad. He's ripping out his hair and trying to kill himself. But is that all that's going on? Because the word is ambiguous. And we also know very clearly from the narrative that he's the one who insisted on not going to battle and sending Patroclus out to die. So it seems to me that that word means two different things. It means both, I lost him, I'm desperate with grief, and also I did kill him. It's my fault that he's dead. And so I felt a translation that only has half of that, it's not quite enough. I need to translate that same word twice. And then similarly, with a slightly different kind of dilemma, he says, I loved him, ison emer kephaler. And a kephaler is a head. In English, we don't usually say of somebody we love very much, I love him like my head, right? So it's not an idiom, whereas it is an idiom in Homeric Greek. So many translators render the idiom by an idiom, like by saying, I loved him like myself, just that. And it seemed to me that the metaphor actually also matters, especially because in this poem, we've had a lot of literal decapitations, like Agamemnon on the battlefield, who's the quote unquote head of the Greek coalition of forces, has cut a lot of people's heads off. And Achilles himself, I mean, the fact that Achilles figures himself as returning to battle without a head, because he doesn't have Patroclus, is like a body part. It's not just a loved member of the household and a quasi-wife, dearest person, second self. It's also like part of his own body. So I felt I need, again, to translate that word with more than one English word, because there's no way to convey both that head means second self or means somebody who's ultra important, but also there's this metaphor of the head. So I felt I had to translate it, with three different words, so that in a way I'm sort of giving the footnote in the text to make sure that you understand both that Patroclus is like Achilles' head, and also that's what that means.
Well, I always really like to humanize my guests, because I think that there's a certain degree of looking at classics and looking at professors and being like, oh, goodness, they're, on this pedestal and they're perfect and they must understand everything the first time that they read it. Because, as you've said, you've been reading the Iliad for years and years and you're so familiar with it and been teaching it to students over and over and over again. So I wanted to pose a question to you, which was, what was the most difficult part of this translation? Like, was there a singular, maybe passage, moment, maybe one that we've already discussed, that you pinpoint as like, that taught me a lot, maybe about yourself as a translator, but also maybe about Homeric Greek, that you walked away thinking, okay, I've done that. I feel really good about myself.
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard to pick out individual moments out of a very long journey. I mean, every day is difficult and every day is wonderful because it's difficult, right? I mean, I think that challenge of these two languages are so different, and it's impossible to, to do what I'm setting myself up to do, of trying to create something like the same experience using completely different words. I think it's a really difficult thing to try to do a translation, but it's also, I mean, I find it really rewarding when people have read my translations and feel that they've noticed things about the original that they hadn't noticed before, that the poems come alive in a different way, and that's just very satisfying and makes me feel good. So I'm thinking we haven't talked about Helen. I thought a lot about how to make sure that encounter between Aphrodite and Helen at the end of book 3 sounds appropriately scary. I mean, it seems to me that sometimes sort of discussions, I mean, I think there's a sort of tendency to sentimentalize very often. I think there's a tendency to sentimentalize the goodbye of Andromache and Hector. I think it's heartbreaking, but not actually sentimental. I think there's also can be a tendency to sort of make the chillingness of the Homeric gods, like the sense of their reality in the world, is really difficult to convey to readers who presumably don't worship these same gods. So I spent a lot of time just sort of trying to make sure I can figure out how to present Aphrodite as this real force in the world who's totally dominating this mortal woman. I mean, there's also something to me so fascinating about the fact that the whole narrative of the poem hinges on the fact that warriors capture, enslave, rape mortal women, but we never actually see that happening. What we see happening is a goddess dominating a mortal woman. So it's through this female agency that the sort of quasi-enslavement of the only woman we see sort of being taken to a man's bed happens. So I thought the chillingness and terror of that scene needs to come across. I mean, there are other scenes that are chilling and terrifying. There are also other scenes that are heartbreaking or exciting or beautiful. Thinking through how those effects can come through in the translation is really difficult. And I certainly didn't get it right every time, but I tried.
So then as a final question, and then I will let you go about your Friday. Just because I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this so it doesn't sound too bad, because I always feel bad when I get these comments, but because I do these summaries, the comments I get are people saying, thank God you've done this so I don't have to read the book. And it makes me really sad because I'm like, that's not the purpose of this summary. The purpose was to help you read. So the reason why I didn't want to sound bad is I know a lot of people are going to be listening to this thinking, oh, great, now I got this whole discussion of the translation. Now I really don't need to go and read the Iliad. So what would you say to that particular person that's listening to this going, fab, I understand everything about Homer, to encourage them to go to the text?
I mean, we actually, we said very little about the text. I mean, I rabbited on about how difficult translation is, but we barely touched the surface even of talking about Achilles and Hector, let alone all the other wonderful wealth of characters that there are in this great poem. I mean, if you don't want to read the Iliad, I kind of find it a bit baffling that you would want to hear us rabbit on, because I mean, I'm not nearly as interesting as Homer is. The Iliad, as I've said, is super interesting and engaging and emotionally exciting, narratively exciting, and at the same time, it has this sort of fascination of something that's both totally human and totally alien, because it's from this very, very distant culture and its narrative tropes, as I was trying to suggest about the representation of sex, but it applies much more generally, are not at all the same as modern readers might assume or presume if you haven't read it. I mean, I would say you can get the audiobook if you're scared to read it. You know, there's a great audio recording by Audra McDonald, who's a wonderful actress and singer, and her voice is great, and she does all the different characters, and you know, you can put it on in your car while you're doing your housework, and it's fun. It's I think if you have any interest whatsoever, don't be put off by the idea that it's going to be way too difficult, because it really is not difficult. And it doesn't matter if you don't know the names of everyone in the catalogue of ships, because some of them are presumably just made up for that purpose. You just need to start reading. And if you find yourself getting stuck, read it out loud. Read it out loud to your cat or your partner and have a good time doing it. I mean, I've heard of lots of people getting together little book clubs of people and, you know, have a drink and read some Homer together. And it's fun, you know, it's a good time.
Well, Dr. Wilson, I could spend all day talking to you about the Iliad, but I am aware that I have run out of my allotted time. So thank you so much, genuinely, for spending even 10 minutes with me and my audience to give us such a great overview of translation and of Homer, getting into some details with us, explaining things so brilliantly. I mean, it means the world to me, and I know that my audience appreciate it greatly as well. And thank you guys for your continued support here on the channel, because without you guys watching, subscribing, sharing these videos, I wouldn't be able to bring on guests like Dr. Wilson. So as I said at the start of the video, you can find all of the different translations that Dr. Wilson has done linked in the description below, as well as her socials if you want to keep up to date with new projects that are coming and classics news, obviously. But with that, I will love you and leave you. So I'll see you next time with more videos here on MoAn Inc. See you then.